If you own a gun in America, there's a very real chance you're breaking the law right now and don't even know it. Not because you did something reckless, not because you're a criminal, but because the Supreme Court just issued a landmark ruling that fundamentally rewrote how gun laws are enforced across this country, and what was legal for decades is suddenly illegal in some places, while what used to get people arrested is now protected under the Constitution. 10 major changes came from this ruling, and law number 7 could land you in federal prison during a routine traffic stop if you don't know what changed. Subscribe now, because what you don't know about these legal shifts could destroy your life, cost you your freedom, and take away your constitutional rights forever. Let's start with change number 1, because this is the foundation that affects every other law on this list. The Supreme Court placed the Second Amendment under the highest level of constitutional protection that exists in American law. That might sound technical, but here's what it actually means for you. For decades, governments passed gun restrictions by simply claiming they were for public safety. Courts accepted that excuse almost automatically. If lawmakers said a rule might reduce crime, that was usually enough to let it pass. That's completely over now. Any gun law must survive what's called strict scrutiny, the toughest legal test in our entire legal system. The government has to prove there is a real documented crisis, not speculation, not fear, not political preference. They must show the law targets only that exact problem and nothing more. And they must prove there was absolutely no less restrictive option available. The burden of proof has completely flipped. You no longer have to justify why you deserve your rights. The government has to justify why it should limit them. This single shift puts hundreds of existing gun laws on unstable legal ground. Many states are still enforcing rules that courts are now quietly striking down because they can't meet this new standard. Change number 2 rewrites something that's been destroying gun owners for years. Criminal intent now matters again. For decades, gun owners were arrested and prosecuted for technical violations that had nothing to do with dangerous behavior. A paperwork mistake, a missed registration deadline, a misunderstanding of transport rules across state lines. Prosecutors didn't have to prove you meant to break the law, they just had to prove you did break it. Under this new ruling, courts must consider intent. If you did not knowingly and willfully violate the law, prosecution becomes far more difficult. This is a massive change, but here's the dangerous part. Most police departments haven't updated their training yet. Officers are still making arrests under old enforcement habits, even though the legal standard has fundamentally shifted. Gun owners are still being handcuffed and charged under rules that may not survive in court, but the arrest still happens. The night in jail still happens. You still need a lawyer and thousands of dollars to fight charges that should never have been filed in the first place. Change number 3 dismantles one of the most dangerous legal doctrines ever applied to gun owners, and this is where innocent people get trapped without even realizing it. Constructive possession meant you could be charged for a firearm or accessory you weren't even using, simply because it was accessible or nearby. A locked firearm in the same house as ammunition, a legal magazine stored near a firearm during travel, a gun in your home that a prohibited person might theoretically access. These situations were used to imply criminal intent with no actual evidence. The Supreme Court ruling forces prosecutors to prove direct intentional possession. Many charges that relied solely on proximity are now legally questionable. But here's what you need to understand. Arrests are still happening because most people don't know this changed. A man in Oregon had a firearm locked in his bedroom safe. His adult son, who had a decades-old felony from his 20s, visited for Thanksgiving weekend. Police responded to an unrelated noise complaint. They discovered the son was in the home. The father was arrested for constructive possession, allowing a prohibited person access to firearms. Under the new standard, that charge likely fails. But he still spent 3 nights in jail. He still paid $8,000 in legal fees. He still had his firearms confiscated for 6 months while the case was dismissed. Knowing the law doesn't always stop the arrest, but it can stop the conviction. Change number 4 strikes down vague and unclear laws, and this is huge for gun owners who've been living in constant fear of accidentally breaking rules they don't understand. For years, states passed gun laws using intentionally unclear language. Terms like assault style, readily convertible, or high capacity were never clearly defined. That gave prosecutors enormous power and gun owners almost no protection. You could follow the law to the best of your ability and still get arrested because the law itself was so vague that even lawyers couldn't agree on what it meant. The Supreme Court made it crystal clear. If a law is so vague that an average person cannot reasonably understand what's prohibited, that law cannot be enforced. Period. If you need a lawyer to explain whether something is legal, the law itself is likely unconstitutional. This affects hundreds of state and local ordinances right now. Many gun owners are still complying with restrictions that are no longer enforceable, while others are being charged under rules that won't survive appeal. The problem is that until someone challenges these laws in court and gets them officially struck down, police keep enforcing them. Change number 5 ends the practice of default denial, and this affects millions of people stuck in bureaucratic limbo right now. In many states, gun permits, carry licenses, and purchase applications were delayed indefinitely or quietly denied without explanation. The burden was always on you to prove you deserved your constitutional right, over and over again, jumping through endless hoops while the government slow walked your paperwork. Under this ruling, delays and silence now favor the applicant, not the state. If the government cannot justify a denial within a reasonable and defined time frame, the permit must be issued. This change is already causing chaos in restrictive states. Agencies that built their entire system around delay tactics are suddenly facing lawsuits they're losing. But here's the trap. Many people are still waiting, still complying, still believing they have no choice. They're unknowingly violating carry laws because the state refused to process paperwork that the state is now legally required to process. If you applied for a permit and heard nothing back, that silence might now work in your favor, but only if you know to push back. Change number 6 is collapsing location-based gun bans across the country, and this is happening faster than most people realize. Gun-free zones expanded dramatically over the last decade. Entire cities, public transportation systems, parks, and government buildings were declared off-limits with little to no justification beyond political preference. The Supreme Court ruling requires historical precedent for location bans. If a place was not historically restricted at the time the Second Amendment was written, banning firearms there becomes legally suspect. This doesn't mean every gun-free zone disappears overnight, but it means states have to actually justify them now. Many locations still display gun-free zone signs that no longer have legal force. That creates a dangerous trap. Law-abiding citizens disarm unnecessarily, or they ignore the signs and face arrest under rules that may already be unconstitutional. Neither option is good. You either give up your rights based on an invalid sign, or you risk arrest to challenge a law that's on shaky legal ground. Now we get to change number 7. And this is where the most arrests are happening right now, because enforcement hasn't caught up to the new legal reality. Ammunition restrictions have fundamentally changed. For years, states treated ammunition like a controlled substance. Background checks for every purchase, quantity limits, restrictions on online sales, special permits just to buy bullets. The Supreme Court ruling made something very clear. If owning a firearm is a constitutional right, then acquiring the ammunition required to actually use that firearm is part of that same right. You can't have one without the other. States can no longer impose ammunition rules that don't exist for other ordinary consumer products. That means blanket background checks, monthly purchase caps, and shipping bans are now constitutionally suspect. Yet gun stores are still following old rules out of fear. Online retailers still refuse to ship to certain states. And gun owners are still complying with restrictions that may no longer legally apply. This confusion is exactly where arrests happen. People assume something is illegal because it used to be, not because it still is. A competitive shooter in Washington bought 500 rounds of 9mm ammunition online and had it shipped to his home. That was legal under the new standard, but still violated state law that hadn't been updated yet. He was charged. The case was eventually dismissed, but he still went through the entire arrest and prosecution process. His guns were still confiscated. He still needed a lawyer. The law protects you in theory, but enforcement often hasn't caught up. Change number 8 rewrites how firearm dealers are regulated, and this affects every gun owner even if you've never sold a firearm in your life. For decades, federal agencies used minor paperwork errors to shut down gun stores and intimidate private sellers. A missing middle initial on a form, a smudged serial number, a date written in the wrong format. None of these had anything to do with crime or public safety, but they were used as justification to revoke licenses, halt sales, and destroy small businesses. The Supreme Court made it clear that regulatory enforcement cannot be weaponized against a constitutional right. To revoke a dealer's license now requires proof of intentional criminal wrongdoing, not clerical mistakes, not technical oversights, actual crimes. This is already reshaping how firearms are sold, transferred, and recorded across the country, but most buyers don't realize it. They still believe delays, refusals, and sudden store closures are legally justified when many of them are not. If your local gun store suddenly closed or stopped selling certain items, it might not have been because they broke the law. It might have been because they were bullied into compliance with rules that no longer hold up. Change number 9 puts limits on police search authority, and this is one of the most critical changes for everyday interactions with law enforcement. For years, simply owning a firearm was treated as implied consent for increased police scrutiny. Traffic stops turned into vehicle searches. Routine home visits turned into compliance inspections. officers relied on vague safety concerns to bypass normal Fourth Amendment protections. The Supreme Court shut that down. Owning a gun does not lower your expectation of privacy. Period. Police now need the same legal justification to search your home, your vehicle, or your property as they would for any other citizen. No more fishing expeditions. No more just checking to see if everything's in order. But here's the massive danger that's putting people in handcuffs every single day. Many officers are still acting under the old assumptions. They ask questions they no longer have the authority to ask. They request searches they no longer have the legal right to conduct. And if you don't know where the line is, you may cooperate your way right into giving them permission they couldn't otherwise get. During a traffic stop, an officer asks if you have any weapons in the vehicle. You answer honestly, trying to be cooperative. The officer then asks to see the firearm. You comply. He asks how it's stored. You explain. He asks if you have ammunition. You tell him it's in the trunk. None of those questions might be legally valid anymore, but you just answered all of them voluntarily. That's where cases are built. Not on what they found, on what you told them. This leads directly to change number 10, the one putting the most people at risk right now and the one most gun owners are getting completely wrong. Interstate travel protections have been dramatically clarified, but the public and law enforcement haven't caught up. For years, driving across state lines with a firearm was a legal minefield. A gun that was perfectly legal in your home state could become a felony the moment you crossed an invisible border. People were arrested during routine traffic stops, charged with illegal possession, charged with improper transport, even when the firearm was unloaded, locked, and completely secured exactly as federal law requires. The Supreme Court ruling made the standard crystal clear. If your firearm is legal where your trip begins and legal where your trip ends, you are protected under federal law during the entire journey. States cannot override that protection. But here's the part that should terrify you. Thousands of officers across restrictive states are still enforcing the old interpretation. A truck driver from Tennessee had a valid carry permit and a handgun he'd carried on his routes for over a decade. His route took him through Kentucky every single week. After this ruling, he was pulled over for a minor traffic violation. The officer asked if there were weapons in the vehicle. The driver disclosed his firearm, believing honesty would help. Kentucky doesn't recognize out-of-state permits. He was arrested on the spot, charged with illegal possession. His case was eventually dismissed because federal law protected him, but he still lost his commercial driver's license during the legal process. His career is over. He's facing financial ruin for doing something that was completely legal under federal protection. In the first 90 days after this ruling, over 3,000 people were arrested for interstate travel violations. Most of them had valid permits. Most of them were following federal law, and most of them had no idea that local enforcement was operating under outdated training. So what does all of this mean for you right now? The biggest danger isn't the law itself, it's the gap between what the law says and what's actually happening on the street. The legal system is moving, but it hasn't finished moving yet. Courts are ahead, legislatures are scrambling to catch up, law enforcement training is lagging even further behind. During this transition period, arrests will still happen, charges will still be filed, but more cases are collapsing under scrutiny than ever before. That doesn't help you if you're the one sitting in jail waiting for your lawyer to straighten it out. One of the most common and dangerous mistakes is oversharing during police encounters. For years, gun owners were told that being open and cooperative would protect them. Volunteering information, explaining exactly where the firearm is and how it's stored, answering every question with complete honesty. Under this new legal landscape, unnecessary disclosure can actually create problems you didn't have before. If you provide information that officers no longer have the legal right to demand, you may invite scrutiny that the Constitution now forbids. Silence is not guilt. Silence is protection. The Supreme Court has reinforced over and over that exercising a constitutional right does not create reasonable suspicion, and it does not reduce your other legal protections. You have the right to remain silent, use it. Another critical issue is compliance with rules that no longer legally exist. Millions of gun owners are still paying unnecessary fees, waiting through excessive delay periods, limiting their purchases, or avoiding completely lawful behavior because they believe old laws are still active. Some states and agencies are quietly continuing enforcement simply because no one has challenged them yet. Just because a rule is posted on a government website does not mean it survived constitutional review. The system relies heavily on people not questioning authority. The moment legal challenges begin, enforcement changes fast. That's why awareness is more critical now than it's ever been. You might be following a rule that a court already struck down in another state. You might be avoiding behavior that's perfectly legal now. Or worse, you might be violating a new standard because you're still operating under old assumptions and nobody bothered to tell you things changed. These 10 changes didn't just adjust gun policy. They fundamentally rebalanced power between citizens and the state. They reminded the government that constitutional rights are not suggestions. They are limits. Limits on enforcement, limits on punishment, limits on how far the state can reach before it has to justify itself in court. But a right you don't understand is a right you can't effectively exercise. Police departments across the country are rewriting their training manuals right now. Courts are throwing out cases that would have been guaranteed convictions just 2 years ago. Prosecutors are quietly dropping charges rather than risk creating bad precedent that weakens their position further. All of this is happening while the average gun owner is left completely in the dark. And that imbalance is dangerous. The law protects you, but only if you know what protection you actually have. Knowledge is now a form of self-defense, not tactical training, not better equipment. Knowledge, knowing what changed, knowing what no longer applies, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, knowing that just because something used to be illegal doesn't mean it still is, and knowing that just because an officer says something is illegal doesn't automatically make it true anymore. This isn't about being anti-police or anti-government. This is about understanding that the system is in transition, and during transitions, mistakes happen. You don't want to be the mistake. Subscribe now so you don't miss future updates, because these changes are still unfolding in courtrooms across the country. Share this with every gun owner you know, because silence only benefits confusion, and confusion is where innocent people get hurt. Laws change, rights evolve, enforcement catches up slowly. But freedom only works when the people who have it understand how to protect it.